80 years ago, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, and that invasion had therefore triggered World War II, the deadliest conflict in known human history. An estimated 70 to 85 million people perished, and most of them civilians, in the Soviet Union and China. So, what was China's role and contribution in the war? Why are peace and stability so important to us? And is the post-World War II global order breaking down? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Dr. Zhao Hai, a research fellow with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and Anna Tangen, current affairs commentator. We shall also speak via satellite to Joe Ray, who is the chairman of the Bridge Tank in Paris. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Well, gentlemen, tell us briefly what has struck you as the most impressive event or people about the Second World War, 80 years on?
I think the common people did shoulder the burden of World War II and fighting every battle to achieve the ultimate victory. So I think in many histories, people only remember people like Winston Churchill, Roosevelt, or Stalin, or Mao, or everybody fighting in this World War II. However, I think it's the common people made the contribution.
Heavy loss, militarily and in terms of human life. Now, Anna, what do you think of the beginning and the conclusion of this bloodiest and deadliest conflict in our known human history?
Well, ironically, given what we have today, you had populists who had risen to the head of their governments in both Italy and in Germany, and they began promising everything. They started identifying who the problems were, and they were extremely aggressive. The rest of the world appeased them. They felt that they could draw a line, that they could contain these individuals and their grandiose plans. In actuality, they couldn't. So this is the 80th anniversary of what started that war, the invasion of Poland that brought Great Britain into the war. At the end, it was 2 nuclear bombs, not in the European theater, but in the Asian theater, that brought to a close this most horrible of wars, and that was massive destruction of civilians, and it should have served as a monument to the need for peace, for understanding, for multilateral cooperation, instead of this kind of nationalism twisted into kind of populist rhetoric and used to
War
kill.
and peace are constant themes for us to take seriously the world order that prevents major countries from going to war again. Perhaps for the Israeli government, the Holocaust is the thing that helps people remember atrocities about the war. There are many things that we can analyze when we look back to commemorate the 80th anniversary. Now, certainly the P5 of the UN Security Council all deserve credit for the construction of the post-war world order, and the United States especially enjoys our worldwide respect for defeating Nazi Germany and for helping build the world order. However, by putting America first, do you think President Trump is likely to derail a very healthy world order that, of course, raises the question about the global impact of a major economy like China? What should we do to prevent the destruction and erosion of the world order?
Well, I agree with my colleague, Dr. Zhao, in this case. What he's doing is the exact opposite of what you would expect somebody who understood how World War II was started and ended. He has divided people. He will continue to do so. He is actively dismantling all of the structures and entities that were out there, and if he's not actually undermining them, I mean, deconstructing them, he's undermining them. He has paid scant attention to the UN. He has complained bitterly of any country impinging on American sovereignty, yet he does not act responsibly. So this is a man who, unfortunately, has all the parts that reminds us of what went wrong way back then.
There are many points that we can discuss that have helped to prevent a third world war. Of course, this process of globalization deserves credit in many, many ways. However, when we look back at what has been done in the wake of the Second World War, perhaps President Roosevelt deserves credit for placing China in the seat of P5 when the United Nations was established. However, a legitimate seat was resumed for the PRC in 1971 at the cost of ousting KMT government that represented Taiwan. What do you think of the role that the United Nations plays in ensuring peace and stability ever since?
Well, it's important to remember that not long after World War II, the Cold War broke out. So in many ways, for many years, United Nations is not actually a functioning body, even though President Roosevelt and the P5 conceived that body as a collective security upholding organization trying to maintain global peace. And I think today the UN's importance is getting more and more obvious, particularly after the Cold War, when countries come together, and particularly when China played a bigger role in terms of maintaining global peace and prosperity. So I think going forward we need to maintain the structure and the integrity of UN.
Let me cross over to Joe Ray, a scholar with a think tank based in Paris, Morocco. Hello, Joe Ray. We are talking about the huge influence of the United Nations and, of course, the vulnerabilities of the world body. Having said that, what do you think of the role of WMD, weapons of mass destruction, and nuclear bombs that were used first by the Americans to defeat the Japanese fascism towards the end of the Second World War? However, denuclearization was prioritized on the agenda of the Bush administration in the wake of the Cold War, fearing that, based on the fear that the warheads could be falling into the hands of a rogue states. Now, today, when you look at DPRK in Iran, the process of denuclearization is still a big challenge ahead. What do you think of, say, the reasons that have prevented the world from going to war as what we saw 80 years ago?
Hi, Young Ray. Huge questions, in fact. I would just like to say that still can draw the lessons of the World War II on all the questions you raised. Because the World War II was two things. It was industrialization of war, and when we talk about mass destruction today, it's still industrialization of war, you know. But the second thing, and I wouldn't call it positive, but that it connected people to people, you know, and what John Lai theorized to be diplomacy, people-to-people diplomacy afterwards, is, I think, extremely useful today. The World War II had people get to know each other. That's true between Western Europe and America, and those bonds are still very strong. That's true within European countries, and we still have many tie-ups across cities and etc. And for denuclearization of Europe, I think even though recently the treaties have gone over, I think the people in Europe will be very vocal about that. And last but not least, you were mentioning some countries in the global south, like Iran, but many others. The World War II had people connect, because many people were involved as army members in the colonial troops of those days, and this has created lasting relationships over the generations. So today, I think those issues of denuclearization, of demilitarization, are not just to be talked at the global level in the forums, in the summits, but also on the people-to-people organization, not the NGOs, of course, but also, you know, on all the associations, on all the, you know, the professional organizations, because you were rightly mentioning globalization. Globalization has some powerful actors now. It's not just the states that have unleashed globalization. Now it has powerful actors, and they are getting voiceful about denuclearization and demilitarization. And one last comment is, I think China has drawn the lesson to that. China is joining the game. China is joining the discussions more at the official level, but also at the people-to-people level. And China has many people-to-people organizations that handle that. So I think I'm not fully optimist, but I'm not that pessimist, you know.
Let's look at who would go down history as the most respectable guy in the Second World War. Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, Joseph Stalin, who is very controversial for the West, or Chiang Kai-shek, who deserves more credit and was portrayed more positively. in Chinese movies in recent years when we come to how to review contributions and sacrifices of the KMT government during the Second World War. Now, Zhang Hai, first of all, who do you think would go down history as the most important, the most influential guy throughout the whole history of the Second World War?
Well, for me, each of those persons you mentioned played their individual roles, and at that historical moment, each actually come to realize their responsibility and executed their jobs in a very good way. And I'm particularly impressed. Of course, ultimately the war's fate is determined by the U.S. joining World War II, and ultimately I think...
By the way, had the Japanese not invaded Pearl Harbor, do you think the United States would have been involved in the Second World War as...
one way or another, I think ultimately the U.S. will jump in, but Pearl Harbor is just giving them an excuse to join it earlier, as earlier as possible. Actually, President Roosevelt tried to find a way to get into the war, and ultimately, remember, right after Pearl Harbor, the first one that the U.S. decided to go front to front is actually Germany, not Japan. So European theater is the #1 concern for the United States. I think Roosevelt made a very difficult but very wise decision. So overall, again, I think people played the most important, ultimately making the ultimate sacrifice. The leaders are just a reflection of the individual people's will. The previous commentator said about industrialization of the war and also the connection of the people. If you look back in history, actually World War I and World War II, many historians argue are interconnected. And it's over. You can see that as a prolonged Great War. Because of the settlement of World War II was very deeply problematic. That actually
settlement of World War II,
of World War I,
yes,
caused World War II. So
Germans were humiliated.
Exactly. So the more successful and fair settlement of World War II leads to more than 70 years of peace. So
is that one of the major reasons why General MacArthur decided to keep the Japanese emperor in place when he started to reconstruct the war-torn country of Japan? But of course, the Japanese emperor also helped cement the morale of the defeated Japan when the Korean War broke out in 1950.
MacArthur's main goal was to roll through China and into Russia. He saw Russia as the #1 threat, and he did not want to have a garrison manning basically Japan. So it was actually easier for him to use the existing apparatus there. This is something that you know, I wish others would have learned in more modern period, rather than trying to destroy everything. If you want to create change, change it at the top and keep the apparatus there. And so I don't see this as it was really about expediency in his part. He was arguing for battlefield command of nukes, despite being close to the devastation that was there. He said if you give him 5, 6 nukes, he could roll all the way to Moscow. So, you know, it was accident things. In terms of heroes, I think really it was the people who fought in the resistance, in the armies, and who decided that they would take part in it, the people who made sure that there was Schindler's List, that were acting humanely in the face of incredible brutality.
Thank you. You are watching Dialogue with Dr. Zhao Hai, Mr. Anna Tanga, and Mr. Zhou Rui. We are discussing the Second World War. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back, gentlemen. Let me go back to Zhou Rui. We were discussing who should go down history as the most respectable, and both of the gentlemen here in the Beijing studio said it's the people, like Mr. Schindler, who saved many Jews. And we also had the Chinese equivalent, the Chinese counterpart of Schindler. Other than that, what do you think of, say, some of the most famous generals like Mr. de Gaulle, who helped to found the Fifth Republic, General Patton from the United States, Eisenhower, so to speak, who helped to liberate the continental Europe. So what do you think should be the guy you respect most when we look at the history of the Second World War?
You know, I'm sorry that I have to join what my fellow analysts have said. I vouch for the people. I vouch for the people. Take those people who were living in their villages. They were 16 years old. They hadn't seen the world. And when de Gaulle, whom you're calling, made his made his famous call from London, then those people, 16 years old, left their families, crossed the country they had never crossed, they had never gone out of their villages, and joined the forces, joined the free forces. My grandfather was one of them. Talk about those people who were in Africa in their villages, and they had not heard much about Europe except through the colonial powers. Most of them were put in the armies by force, forcibly, but some of them, and a sizable number of them, just joined and said, there's war somewhere, we want to go there, we want to see the world, we want to contribute. Take China, the villagers from China who went out of their village for the first time by joining the People's Liberation Army. I think they're the true heroes, and their women who supported them, who faced all the consequences sitting back in the village, were, I think, you know, were the real heroes.
You know, Joe Ray, some of the Chinese villagers never left their homes because they were looted, burned, and killed. For example, my grandfather never left his own village in Henan province, where this policy of burning, killing, and looting led to the massive killings of thousands upon thousands. My uncle also died in the guerrilla warfare against the Japanese invaders. So what do you think of the role the Chinese played in the Pacific Theater, where the Royal Japanese troops were mobilized after Pearl Harbor? What do you think?
I completely agree. All civilians paid a heavy toll, you know, heavy toll. And this was the first time there was such a toll on the civilians. That's why I talked about industrialization of war. Now, the toll by the civilians, paid by the civilians has never been appreciated in general all over the world. But some regions, for some regions, it's even more unequal. You know, China paid a heavy toll, and this never got much discussed beyond, I would say, historian circle, simply because the theater of operations was Sino-Chinese. You know, Japanese were in China, but the Chinese people fought and suffered within China. Whereas in Europe, as the countries are smaller, there were cross-boundary kind of exchanges and suffering. So this got more magnified at that time.
We lost 20 million people in the Second World War.
I know.
What do you think of the starting point of the Second World War? Some would argue, for example, Professor Rana Mitter from Oxford University argued in his book, China, Forgotten Ally in the Second World War, that the starting point of the Second World War should be 2 years earlier, like in Marco Polo Bridge, where the hostilities really broke out between Japanese and the KMT troops.
Yeah, I'm no historian, but my reading of social sciences makes me think that historical so-called facts have to be revised constantly. And definitely there is some ground for considering that the Manchuria events, for instance, are seriously part of the Second World War.
Yes, Manchuria was invaded back in 1931 by the Japanese. And many Chinese historians argue that the 1931 should be the watershed for the World War II.
At least a watershed, yes. I would tend to think so. And I think that history has to be re-looked at from the perspective where we stand now, as a globalized humanity, and no longer having history in silos, you know.
Well, I would disagree with that. I think facts are facts. I don't think no matter how you look at history, 20 million people killed is going to change. Quite frankly, what you have here with that earlier start at the Marco Polo Bridge was a war against fascism, or resistance against fascism, which was the real culprit here. This was this idea of what? Putting countries first, putting races first. And this is why I draw parallels between then and today. When you start having people who are willing to espouse, in essence, the exact same ideas that were espoused back then, it really sends a chill up your spine.
Let me go back to Zhou Rui. Some of the diplomats earned their seats in the course of history by writing very good articles. For example, George Kennan, a senior diplomat who was deployed in Moscow, wrote a table famous cable describing what happened between the former Soviet Union and the United States as an iron curtain that descended on, Winston Churchill also joined him in describing the beginning of the Cold War. Do you think we are repeating the same mistake in the 21st century between the United States and China? Look at the trade war, 5G, so on and so forth. The growing rivalries between the two biggest economies. Are we going to see a return of the Cold War?
You know, where the parallel stops immediately is that at that time, America wanted to impose its order. Nowadays, it's striking. America is undermining its own order. Okay, the UN is not the US. Okay, the World Organization is not the US. Okay, the IMF, the World Bank is not the US. But these are institutions that were not only put in place by America, but that were and are still today very instrumental for America at a cost which is very limited, very reasonable. So I think that America today is under a severe lack of analysis, and they're getting the scene wrong. That's my personal thinking. Now we're going towards a Cold War. I think, again, the situation is different, because to have Cold War, you need pounds country. You need countries that align to your wish to make a Cold War. And nowadays, decades down the line, many countries have a much more refined breed of leaders, much more refined breed of economic society, civilian society, and I think it's less easy to be manipulated. So I don't think we're going towards something that massive as a Cold War. We're going into troubles, we see that every day, but not a Cold War, no.
Well, Anna, no one underestimates the powerful role the United States plays, because it is a sole superpower. Look at the military budget. By the year 2015, the United States has spent $1.5 trillion in Afghanistan and Iraq. What do you think the United States should have done to use this huge military budget for construction of the infrastructure, for improvement of the livelihoods back in the United States? So why do you think the United States would always use the gumbo policies and the military muscles to feature its own prominence as a world leader?
Because it can. It has the largest military, as you pointed out, and there are those within the United States, John Bolton, for example, who believes that you have to use, you can't just show the stick, you have to actually use it. This is the kind of thinking that, as I said, has parallels both to World War I and II. And while I agree that those wars are interconnected, actually history is always interconnected, and one thing leads to the next. Even solutions lead to new problems. And this is the difficulty that we face here today. We are in a changing environment, economically, technologically. Things are changing. There's going to be displacement of individuals, and there might be new ideologies that arise because of that. But instead of trying to put things in perspective and trying to anticipate the changes that need to happen within countries, you have countries hearkening back to some sort of nostalgic past which they idealize not today, when in fact there were never idealistic past. There are always problems that were presented at that time. But this kind of dangerous thinking was prevalent, especially during World War II, in both Italy, Japan, and Nazi Germany. They all said things, let's go back to the days when we were powerful and rulers.
We haven't seen the darkest hours and darkest days yet in the post-Cold War era. However, many in the United States are beginning to discuss the idea and the prospects of having a third world war. For example, the Thucydides trap, first put forward by Harvard professor Alison Graham. Do you think what can be done to avoid major conflict between the two major militaries? China, the rising power, the United States, the residing power. Do you think there's inevitably a major clash?
First of all, it's not inevitable. Nothing is inevitable. As in this book, I think it's too deterministic. If only we can draw history, and every time history repeats itself, then we don't have to fight for ourselves. But then again, to think about the next world war, we have to think about the dangers, how to avoid it. But first of all, now all the major states are nuclear states. the war against each other is unthinkable because that will lead to the total destruction of the world. So MAD, mutually assured destruction, is still here. So I don't think major countries can go to war with each other. However, that doesn't mean that in marginal terms and in other means that they cannot fight with each other. Trade war is actually a symptom of some kind of war going on between the two countries, competition, even adversarial relationship. So I think this, if not being reasonably thought out and have an agreement between the two sides, that could lead to more severe confrontation between the two. And I think the war between the United States and China is not possible, but other countries, when this whole situation, the whole system is destabilized, other part of the world could have wars broken out between other factors. And that's a very tragic thing, because if the U.S. and China focus only on each other, they don't take care of the world peace, then I think more troubles will come.
When we look back, do you think animosity and rivalries are growing to a point where our two militaries will go to war?
Well, I mean, if you understand where you are in history, you can avoid it. It's only when you don't, or you choose not to. I mean, the difficulty is you have Donald Trump, who does not believe in history. He does not believe in reading, analysis. He doesn't like to even hear the security briefing that he's supposed to get each morning. So in these kinds of instances, when you have populist leaders who are rising, who are saying that history doesn't matter, that only what I do matters, and that I can, quote, make my country great again, that it's all about us, this kind of selfishness, then you have all of the necessary ingredients for tragedy. Now, I think in China's case, they saw a lot of this. The reason that you have a Belt and Road Initiative, I think initially, was to prevent being bottled up in the seas, where the U.S. has an overwhelming power superiority. So China went to the back door. And these are the types of things that I think you try to avoid direct confrontation.
Thank you very much. Joe, Ray, very quickly, what would you say to conclude our discussion about the Second World War? Very quickly.
On its impact today and on the risk of a war today, I can't agree more with what was just said. What runs Washington, D.C. today is not ideology, it's a hubris of a man. That's volatile, that's dangerous, but that can go off. Let's see within 1 year what happens, or maximum within 5 years. And let's hope within those 5 years we don't have a third world war, and after that we're free of that risk.
When I interviewed the former Israeli ambassador regarding the Holocaust in the Second World War, he said, "We could probably forgive, but we'll never forget." With that, we conclude this discussion about the Second World War, and we'll look ahead and think seriously about how we can avoid the repeat of the Cold War before the outbreak of a possible hot war. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.